Hey there, creatives. I am excited that you continue to listen, and I hope you enjoy episode 4 of season 2. And you'll be listening to a conversation that I had with Dr. Dan L. Edmunds. And he specializes in kind of the realm of spirituality and what he refers to as extreme states of mind and autism. And we kind of talked about all of those topics. And he presented this idea of radical compassion in our conversation as really a foundational tool for um, being being with clients when we might not fully understand what it is that they're presenting or speaking about, but how radical compassion, when we listen from that place without an agenda, that we can really align and attune and help to move them forward. And it's just a really intense, beautiful conversation. And I hope you enjoy listening to it as well.
The Creative Psychotherapist is the official podcast of the Creative Clinicians Corner, a practice building resource for creative psychotherapists. TCP Podcast is the cast for creative, expressive, and experiential focused psychotherapists curious to learn how to design, build, and scale a thriving private practice. Your host, Raina Lombardi, interviews successful therapists about the tools and strategies they have used to develop creative, focused practices. They also talk about the products, services, and side hustles they have developed using their knowledge and creativity to enhance their therapy practices, make a greater impact in their communities, and diversify their income streams. Welcome. Now here's your host, Raina Lombardi.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Psychotherapist podcast. I'm your host, Rena Lombardi, and I'm excited to welcome my next guest. His name is Dr. Dan L. Edmunds, and he received a doctorate of education in pastoral community counseling from Argosy University in Sarasota in 2006. He first developed an interest in religions and cultures at the age of 14 and began visiting various communities, a special interest he still maintains, and from which he can now recite scriptures and verses in Latin, Greek, Slavonic, Punjabi, Hindi, Arabic, and Hebrew. At the age of 16, he became the youngest legislative intern in the state of Colorado and later served on staff of various political campaigns. He graduated in 1993 from Fort Collins High School and completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Florida in 97 with a major in religion and a minor in sociology. He holds a Master of Arts in Theology from the University of Scranton, and while there, he published in the Diaconia Journal for Eastern Christian Studies. Dr. Edmunds has lectured at various colleges and universities and at professional conferences, including the National Association of Social Workers, Society for Humanistic Psychology, Alternative Education Resources Organization, and the Center for the Study of Psychology and Psychiatry. He's contributed to Psychology Today, Chronogram, Autism File Magazine, Autism World, Autism Parenting, Catholic Stand, Mad in America, and Psychology Tomorrow. He's also presented on the Philadelphia CNN affiliate, Shrink Wrap Radio, Autism Radio, Relevant Radio, and various local radio programs across the United States. He's the author of Meeting of Two Persons, Comprehensive Drug-Free Approach to ADHD, Metanoia, Metaphysical Metaphors, Being Autistic, Cosmic Dance, Sacred Space, and Voices in the Wilderness, Sutra on Despair and Overcoming, Absurdity and the Courage to Be, Bhakti, and Voices Within. Dr. Edmunds is a member of the Psychoanalytic Center of Philadelphia, honorary member of the Dominica Psychological Society, associate member of the New York Institute for Gestalt Therapy, and a member of the International Society for Science of Existential Psychology. Dr. Edmunds is board certified in sexual abuse, trauma issues, and forensic traumatology, and he is the adjunct professor for the Interfaith Seminary and an advisor to Ish, Nepal, a mental health advocacy organization. Welcome. Thank you so much for being
Yes, thank you. Thank you
here.
for having me.
So, I would love to talk with you about how you merged from your focus on spirituality into the world of mental health.
Okay, well, that was an interesting journey. Is as I mentioned, that was something from very early on uh, that I developed kind of a special interest in, and something that I could go on and on about, sometimes boring people when I was younger, and probably even now. Um, Initially, that was kind of my path. So through my studies, I was looking towards ministry and also teaching. Um, but I had an encounter. This was right after I received my master's, where a friend of mine had a colleague who had developed the first sexual abuse crisis shelter and center for male victims of abuse. And oftentimes that population is neglected. And I was fascinated by her work, and we became friends. And I worked alongside her initially, and that developed my interest in the field of mental health. And then shortly thereafter, I did take on a position where I was working first with children and adolescents, and now we're 23 years later.
So just natural kind of merging, and you've stayed
Right,
within that.
right.
And what do you think, having so much knowledge around spirituality, what's the role of spirituality in mental health?
One of the things that I have noticed with a lot of the individuals that I've encountered is that through the experiences that they've had, there oftentimes is a crisis of meaning,
Mhm.
that they're kind of looking at, all right, what is going on in my life? Why am I here? Why am I having to confront these things that I would interpret as being absurd? How do I make sense of the world around me? How do I make sense of just being with others? So that spiritual aspect becomes a very important piece of how one kind of finds their sense of being, how they create meaning um, of their experiences that they have had, and how they're able to forge connections with others. So, um, and I guess the other point I'll make too is that I think the awareness that I've developed over time for different spiritual traditions has given me an insight in being able to kind of embrace diversity for one,
Yeah.
and to have a sense of just kind of looking at us all as a human family.
Mhm.
um, and I think it's important to have awareness of different belief systems, because I think that many times that becomes problematic as well, is that we see people with different beliefs, different rituals, different ways of interacting, and when people don't understand these things, sometimes that has the potential to create divisions and conflicts that are oftentimes unnecessary if we had a true level of understanding.
Yeah, no, I think that is certainly evident in our history, right? As human beings, that we can religion is often a source of division and war and things like that.
Right.
But I hear you in that um, when we're talking about mental health, how it brings up that those existential questions of why are we here, why am I having this experience, and how do I make meaning from that? How do you think that as a profession, as a mental health profession, how could we be doing more to invite these conversations around our clients' spirituality into the work that we do? I think in talking with lots of therapists over the years, some people are naturally open to that, and some people are not. But I'm just
Right.
wondering.
I think, unfortunately, that there is sometimes a fear by
Mhm,
some therapists to approach those conversations. And sometimes I think the fear might be based on just either the lack of knowledge or a fear that, well, I have my own particular beliefs and I don't want to get that mixed in with the client's particular beliefs, that sort of thing. And when I look at the term spirituality, I'm not necessarily implying religion or religiosity. That I'm looking at that is just one's worldview. How do they interpret experiences that they've had? How do they just basically interpret their life?
mhm,
Um, and so I think that that can always be a starting point. Um, but I do think it's important too that if certain people, maybe they have embraced a particular religious faith, um, to have an awareness and understanding, okay, well, what is that belief system about? How does this impact that individual? What does it do for them? um how do they see the world through the lens of their particular belief system?
mhm, mhm. Yeah, no, it's really, really great thinking there. How do they see the world through that particular viewpoint? Because how we see the world is going to impact how we're functioning and the beliefs that we
Exactly.
have about ourselves and our relationships with others. Yeah. So when obviously you have a wide educational experience in specific spiritual practices, faiths, um, I- are there any that really speak to you and like inform your own worldview?
um I have felt that there's been things from a number of traditions that I can find value in. Particularly from the Buddhist tradition, I find mindfulness and meditation to be personally immensely uh, useful. Um, I have to admit, I have a particular fondness for some of the liturgical music from the Christian tradition. And so I've looked at that. I've tried to kind of be embracing of many different experiences. And well, I'll mention a little story too that I didn't even realize it was near my home, but one of the largest Hindu communities is nearby, one of the largest in the U.S. that is. And so when I discovered it, being me, I had to walk in and check it out and see, okay, what is this community all about? And they were very kind and took me in, showed me everything that was there, had lunch with them, so forth. And I continued to visit there and try to get an understanding of the people, and found it just kind of an amazing, wonderful experience. And also the grounds itself was quite beautiful. Um, and so for me, that was important to be able to just kind of explore. I think some people would maybe have an interest and a curiosity about it as they pass by it, but to actually go in and actually explore, they might be kind of afraid, like, I don't know these people,
Yeah.
I don't know what this is all about. So to be able to, hopefully for people to be able to move past that and to say, okay, that yeah, I can try to connect with cultures and beliefs that might not necessarily coincide with my own, but maybe there is something that I can learn from it, and there's something they can learn from me.
Yeah. No, I think that's beautiful to be able to do that, to feel comfortable enough to do that, and to be received in,
Right,
in that space and say, yes, let me share this with you so that you have a better understanding of, what's happening here.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. How how does how does this influence your understanding of what it means to be somebody with autism?
Well, I think when we really look at it, that I think that's probably where the interest developed to begin with. I think it probably is, some would say, kind of a quirky autistic trait that I might have had, to have had that interest from so young, and to be able to go on and on about these various things. Um, but I think that I've been able to transform that into something that's actually been useful and productive. Um, so so maybe before it wasn't as useful and productive, but I think now it's something that I can utilize in a way to be able to connect with others, and to be able to share with others. Okay, let's kind of broaden ourselves, and let's look at the experiences that others have, um, across the board, universally.
Yeah, right. It is a spirituality in itself is a universal experience, something that it exists within all cultures to some capacity. And it certainly is a point of connection. Yeah. So when you're working with other individuals, say if you were working with somebody with autism, what would be some of the things that you would hold at the forefront of, like, questions that you might ask um, to better understand their experience of their spiritual practice, um, how it informs how they're operating in the world, and how that might be present or not present in terms of their relationships with themselves and others?
Okay. Well, when it comes to autism, there's I'll mention some principles that I've kind of laid down and certainly abide by, and encourage others to consider.
Mhm.
Um, one of the first and probably extremely important things is the idea of presuming intellect. So sometimes we'll encounter people that are autistic, and maybe they're not using verbal communication
Sure.
or that sort of thing, and some will unfortunately make that assumption. Well, okay, they're not using verbal communication, they're not speaking to me, so somehow they're lacking in intellect, or they don't have anything to say at all, or something along
Right.
those lines. And those are false assumptions to make. I think having a level of respect, having a level, treating people with dignity, and also, and this doesn't just apply to autism, the
Right.
idea of autonomy,
Hmm.
of allowing people to make choices. um and and I think also, particularly when it's come to individuals that I've worked that were in the autism spectrum, that many of the things that I ask them is kind of looking at, well, if they do have special interests or something, well, why are these things important to you? What do they signify to you? What do they mean for you? What do they do for you? So trying to just kind of enter their world, enter their space, and get an understanding of what is significant to them. Because sometimes I think there can be a lot of dismissal by individuals,
Yeah.
that they'll say, oh, well, why are they doing these certain behaviors? Why do they have these particular interests? Um, Without looking at, okay, why exactly is that important to them? What's significant? What meaning does that give to that individual? Um,
Right.
so maybe to some that might seem, they may have some thoughts or behaviors or whatever that appears to be unusual, um, from an outside perspective, but it may be something very important to that person, and we have to kind of look at, well, why is that?
Yeah, I think that is so important, and I really appreciate, you know, what you're saying about respecting the individual's autonomy to be able to determine that for themselves, even if other people might not understand or have a similar, viewpoint. I think that that happens a lot where um, the focus of what is important seems um, it can be hard, I think, for some neurotypical people to understand why would that person be so focused on that particular topic. Maybe it seems it's not so important to them. Like maybe it's a particular show, for example, or a particular style of art. As an
Right.
art therapist, I see a lot of individuals that they're amazing at their art, and but they choose maybe to focus on one particular subject matter. Um, right, that there is something meaningful there for them, even if other people don't understand it.
Right. Well, I can give one example too, that I remember I had a young man that I had worked with, and this was quite some time ago, that he would make videos, and he had like little puppets in it, and each of the puppets had various voices, and he loved doing this, and he did this all the time. But people around him and his family thought, well, this is just a strange little quirky thing that he likes to do. But actually sitting down and paying attention to the videos and looking at, okay, what are these different voices, and who are these different characters he has in the video? What do they signify? And what I learned was that he was telling stories about himself. So as he was encountering good things and some not so good things, so I guess he dealt with some bullying, he would act these things out in his videos. That was his way of coping. That was his way of expressing. And I guess the interesting thing too is that his family, they didn't think that he was going to make it on to college and survive that whole experience, but he did. And of course, his degree ended up being dealing with video production.
That makes sense.
So
Yeah.
that's a key thing too, is that I found in many times with the people that I've worked with, is that sometimes through their school years, they might have various struggles, but once they find their niche and you
Mhm.
help them to do that, they're brilliant, and they often take off with these amazing abilities. And that was kind of the thing that he did, that he took something that people didn't necessarily understand in the beginning, but made it work for him.
Yeah. No, that's a great story. Um, Glad that he was able to do that for himself. I think that that is true. When people connect with what they're really passionate about, that they can excel in that area and have really, you know, fulfilling lives.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. This episode of The Creative Psychotherapist is brought to you by Florida Art Therapy Services. Florida Art Therapy Services is a proud provider of continuing education sponsored through the Florida Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and offers a wide variety of continuing education trainings on the topics of supervision, art therapy, and other requirements for Florida licensure. We are excited to be welcoming special guest trainers, art therapists Carol Cox and Amy Bucciarelli, who will be teaching a Mastering the Meaning of Mandalas training. It's a 3-day intensive training, which will allow participants to earn 20 hours worth of CEUs. And that's going to be taking place April 28th through 30th, 2023, at our Fort Myers office. Over the course of the 3 days, people will be exploring mandala making as a way to find identity and meaning through the lens of the life cycle. It's taught in a unique format, which incorporates lectures, meditation, music, and lots of artistic creation of mandalas as well. I took this training in 2019 and I was blown away by the content, and it's altered my work since having taken the training. And I'm excited to take it again. And I really encourage you all to check it out. If you have any interest in deepening your understanding of the mandala and helping to use it as a source of greater understanding with your clients, I highly recommend checking it out. Amy and Carol do a phenomenal job. And you can learn more about that training and all the other trainings that we provide at Florida Art Therapy Services on our website, www.floridaarttherapyservices.com. Just click on the continuing education menu and you'll get a drop down and you can click on Mastering the Meaning of Mandalas or one of the other trainings as well. So I know that one of the topics that you said you could speak about was this concept of extreme states of mind. Can you tell me
Yes.
a little bit about what that means?
When I use the term extreme states of mind, this would be experiences that individuals have that uh, commonly within the psychiatric system would probably be labeled as schizoaffective, schizophrenia, that sort of thing, and or voice hearing
Mm-hmm.
experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I've spent a lot of time working with these individuals as well, trying to be faithful to their experience and to convey what it actually might signify. And and many times I think when people are going through these extreme states that they are very much misunderstood. Um,
Yeah.
and so I'll give a couple little brief stories in that regard of some of the work there. So I remember some time ago there was a gentleman, and I'll refer to him as John. His family, his mother in particular, contacted me, and she was very distressed because he had been put into a state hospital facility, and she was hoping that one day he would not be there and that he could come home. But what she was distressed about is, she said that granted he makes some very unusual statements, but she felt that many people, even the staff there, they just kind of dismissed it like, that's unintelligible, we're not going to even touch this, we're not going to interact with it. And he just kind of languished. So I went to meet with him, and he was a very kind-hearted person, very friendly and engaging. But granted, he did have some unusual statements that he made to me. So the first thing, now he was Caucasian, but he told me that he was born as an African American child, and he was bleached when he was 2 years old. Which, okay, so I could understand somebody hears that and they're like, this doesn't make any sense, and they would just kind of put that aside, like, okay, I don't think I want to talk to him anymore, that doesn't make any sense. But it did have significance. The other thing he related was that he felt that he was being controlled through most of his life. And he described it as a frequency. He said that I can't make my own choices. Everything is controlled in my life. So I got an understanding from his mother of some of the things that he had encountered. Now, at 2 years old, he began to be physically abused by his father. His father, it turns out, was involved in various racist organizations. So when you delved into it, you could see that he was speaking metaphorically. So this whole idea that he was bleached, well, that obviously wasn't literal, but it was basically his jab towards his father. And he was afraid of his father. He was very frightened by him. And his father was this very controlling, domineering figure in his life. So when he said he felt like he couldn't make choices and so forth, well, that was true. So that's what I've noticed as well, is that the majority of the time, if not all the time, the people in these extreme states were speaking to me the truth. They were telling me something about their experience. However, it was very steeped in this metaphorical language. And I had to be able to break through and decode and try to understand, what are they actually trying to say? What are they trying to tell me? How can I learn this language to have an understanding of their experience? There was another young man that I recall that when I first encountered him, he had this idea that he was God and Satan at the same time. So, like I said, people would probably look at that and say, okay, that's odd. Let's shut. And sometimes that's the first avenue, is that when you find something unusual or you don't understand, let's just shut it down. Let's just suppress it. Let's kind of make it go away or pretend like it doesn't exist. So what I learned about him was that through his life, he was often invalidated, made to feel powerless. And some of the situations he was dealing with, some of the reactions that he had to it weren't always the best ones and got him into troubles. So the God part was this desire to control events, to have a sense of, I have power over things. The Satan part was some of the guilt and shame that he had for some of the reactions that he had. So as we kind of worked together and journeyed through this, he came to a point where he wasn't God and Satan at the same time anymore, but he started to believe, well, maybe I'm a messenger of God. that I have this message that I want to change the world. I want things to be different. And so I kind of understood that okay, he wants to change the environment around him. He wants things to be different, which doesn't everyone at times.
Yeah.
Um, so I kind of worked with that. And one of the key things, which I find, is that we were able, fortunately, to change up his environment. So he ended up getting his own place to live. He got a job, and then eventually got into an academic program. So these were all great things and very important components. As he started plugging into all this, and he had a great work ethic, and people were validating him, giving him a lot of positive feedback for what he was doing. The statement that I think was very important is that he came to tell me, he said, well, I decided, I'm not this messenger of God. He said, I don't feel that I need to be. He said, because I feel like I'm truly human again.
Wow.
So that was a very powerful statement, that he didn't need to have those beliefs that people would have labeled as delusions or what have you any longer, because now he felt that he could be in the world of others, that he started to develop more of an understanding of himself and started to feel more connected. And last little thing I'll mention too, and this was kind of along similar lines, was a woman that came to see me that had told me that she was Mary Magdalene,
Mm-hmm.
and her boyfriend was Jesus. Now, some would probably approach that as, no, you're not Mary Magdalene. No, he's not Jesus. Stop that
Right.
sort of thing. Well, I didn't take that approach. I approach it in the beginning. Well, tell me what it's like being Mary Magdalene. Tell me about this Jesus guy. What's he all about? What does he do? And we approach it in that way. And then as I got to know more about her story, I learned why she connected so much to that story. It
Mm-hmm.
made perfect sense. Now, I didn't lead her on to what I discovered. I let her come to that discovery on her own. And eventually she did, and it took some time, she came to that conclusion. Well, no, I'm not actually that person, but I relate to that story very deeply.
Yeah.
And she was able to also come to a point of significant recovery. Um, and it like I said, it wasn't an overnight thing. It was definitely a very long process to reach to that point. Um, but I think that it was a very interesting and very important journey, that she took to be able to make that discovery of why she connected so much with that particular story. Um, and so like I said, I think that we have to, when we see these individuals that are in these extreme states of mind, that we still have to look at them as fellow human beings. And
Mm-hmm.
I find it interesting too that when we look at the term schizophrenia,
Yeah.
that schiz means broken or divided, and phren is the heart. And if we go back to Greek philosophy, Aristotle believed that the soul was not in the brain or the mind, but was
Mm-hmm.
within the heart. So if
Yeah.
we take a literal interpretation of what schizophrenia means, it means broken hearted. And I think that's a very good description of the people that I have encountered, of what their experience has actually been.
Yeah.
So we have to kind of journey with them and be able to help them mend these broken fragments of their heart.
Mm. I have the goosebumps listening to you talk about it like that. I've never heard anybody describe it in that way, but and my experience in doing this work for a really long time now too is in encountering people who have experienced some significant trauma, and the trauma is what's underneath the presentation of those symptoms that we're seeing that don't really make
Right.
sense.
Now that's something that's important to mention as well, is what I call the two trauma mechanism. And this is
Mm,
something that I've seen play out many times as well. So when you're dealing with various psychoses, oftentimes you will see that there was a very significant trauma that happened to the person, usually before 2 years old.
mm,
And I compare it to like an abscess, that it begins to grow and grow and grow. And sometimes the thoughts and feelings are repressed and so forth. And then there's a subsequent trauma later in their life. For some, it's late teens, early 20s. And that's when everything kind of bursts and you see what would be termed as the positive and negative symptoms kind of coming forward. And then there can be various triggering events down the road, that
mhm,
things that are also significantly traumatic, that it shifts the person backwards to that earlier frame of mind. So you see, like, worst case scenario, a person who is terribly frightened, terribly traumatized, what do? They might go into the fetal position.
mhm,
So you see how that trauma shifts a person back to those earlier frames of mind. Now, I'll mention something too, tying back to spirituality, that you have a number of examples of individuals throughout history and various spiritual traditions that were looked upon at that time as very eccentric. They
mhm,
might have even been reviled during their lifetime, only much later to be revered.
mm,
So one example I can give from the Russian Orthodox tradition was Saint Xenia. So she was a woman, her husband was in the military, had died, and she donned his military uniform and would walk the streets of St. Petersburg wearing this military uniform, and gave away all of her possessions to the poor. Now, many would look at that as, well, that's very unusual. She was later canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church and is revered as a saint within that tradition. Within Buddhism, you have a term called Yeshe Cholwa, which means sacred madness. And these were Buddhist teachers who gave their teachings in very unusual ways that kind of defied the norms of that day. Um, and then I guess, well, I'll give one other example. Lastly, that this comes from the Sufi tradition, and I think this is kind of an amusing story, that there was a Sufi teacher named Nasruddin, and he was asked to speak to a gathering of people. And he went there and he asked them the question, well, do you know what I'm going to say? And the people didn't know exactly how to respond. So they said, well, yes. So he said, well, if you already know what I'm going to say, then I don't need to speak. And then he left. So they begged him to return. He returns again and he says, well, do you know what I'm going to say? So people kind of confused. Some said yes, some said no. And he said, well, the people that know what I'm going to say can tell it to the people that don't. And then he left again. And finally, they got him to come and speak. But that would have been looked upon as, well, that's rather eccentric behavior
sure.
as well. Now, what I look at, okay, if we took these individuals and we put them into our society today, how would psychiatry look upon them? How would society itself look upon them? What would we do? Would we just label them? Would we try to suppress them? How would we interact with that experience? So I think that that's important to look at as well. And sadly, through our history, there have been examples, and some more graphic. So I think about the times where lobotomy occurred to individuals,
Yeah.
and this is like worst case scenario. For a time, people looked at that as progress. They thought this was a good thing. And
Mm,
the only reason why they did was because the person was docile. They weren't a bother to anybody. They didn't
Mhm.
have to be in the hospital anymore. We could bring them home, but were they functional? Were they really
Right.
in a shape that was positive? No. So I think we have to look at that too. What is our idea of progress for an individual? And I don't think that that idea should come from us. That idea should come from them.
Yeah.
But oftentimes through our history, we have looked at this falsely, this idea of progress being just making a person not be a bother to anybody.
Right. I think in some ways we do that with medication now, right? Maybe not lobotomy, but certain
Yes, yes,
meds.
I think sometimes so I in saying this, it's not to be misinterpreted. I'm saying that medication is terrible and we shouldn't use
Of
it at all.
course. Yeah.
But I think that there are situations where people can be over medicated, or
Mhm.
they can be told these kind of grim prophecies. Well, you're going to need medication the rest of your life, sort of thing. And maybe they do, maybe they don't.
Mhm.
Um, or that becomes sometimes, rather than looking at various other alternatives and trying to understand the experience, that becomes the first thing. Well, let's just do something that shuts the experience down, that makes it just kind of go away. And sometimes medication is that avenue just to kind of suppress everything rather than really dealing with the core issues at hand.
Yeah. Yeah. Ugh. Those are like really big, heavy um things for us to be considering in our profession. Um, right? If yes, the
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that unfortunately there's kind of a fear of that as well, that some people really don't want to touch those areas, but I think that they're important, and we really need to examine. So so when I look at the term treatment itself,
Mhm.
treatment isn't what we do to other people. It's treatment is how we interact with them in a sense
Mm.
of values.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we connect with this individual? But sometimes wrongfully that does become the idea that we put people into certain situations, and okay, we're going to treat them, we're going to do things to them to make them more amenable to society. But I think that that's a wrong use of the word treatment.
Mhm. I like that reframe about the interaction. Um, and I I do agree with you that these are important things for us to be discussing and considering. And even in particular, your reframing of some of, the terms that we typically would use, right? If instead of saying psychosis, that this is an extreme state of mind and thinking, but there is a way to reach the person at their core based on how you're describing your interactions with people to understand what is it about the story that they're saying they're talking with and having conversations with God, or that they are God, or maybe they're talking with a past president. Um, how do we talk with them about that experience? Because in doing that, we're meeting them where they're at, we're respecting their autonomy, and through the metaphor, we can help them start to unravel and maybe begin to change that story. Or at least that's what I heard in the way you described the anecdotes of the different people that you were working with.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And that's something that I don't think we see very often, when people are in those states of mind that, like you were saying, it is often let's shut it down and deny, no, that's not true. You're not in reality right now. Rather than joining them where they're at and helping them to come to terms of the reality that they're existing in, wherever that may be, right? We're in different realities at different times in our lives based on our circumstances of what we're going through.
Right. And I think sometimes we have to put aside assumptions, and even in the more challenging circumstances, to be able to be creative and say, how can we possibly reach this person?
Mhm.
So, well, I'll give you a little example with this too. That some time ago, I used to do evaluations at this alternative school, and there was one young man that the staff weren't too fond of him. The other students weren't too fond of him. And granted, he could be rather difficult at times. He
Mhm.
he wasn't always the most pleasant person to deal with. So I was only there once a week, but I remember somehow we just kind of clicked, and he would, when he was having difficulty, he would come and talk with me and so forth. And but that, my thought was, okay, how is he going to be reachable? What can we do? Because everybody was kind of down on him and like, oh, you can't even bother to talk with him, and you're not going to get anywhere, or he's just going to be nasty to you or whatever. So we got into this conversation about music, and he was a foster kid,
Mm.
and so he told me a lot about his experience there. But aside from that, what he told me is that he really had this musical interest, but because he was in this foster home, he said, nobody's going to get me music equipment. I'm not going to have these things. So I made that deal with him. I said, okay, I'll have to admit that whenever your name comes up lately, it hasn't been in a very good way. So
Mhm.
I said, let me see if for 3 weeks you can turn that around, and maybe I might hear some type of positive feedback within that 3 weeks time. And I said, and it only needs to be one thing. If I can hear just one positive thing within that 3 weeks time, then this amplifier that you want, you're going to get. So, of course, he was a perfect angel within that 3 weeks time, and he got his amplifier, and he was thrilled. And but I also remember him saying that too. He said, "Well, I can't believe that somebody actually cared enough to do that." But that's what I was telling him. I said that you have to start to find value within yourself, and over time, his attitudes and his interact, because he felt that, okay, there's somebody that actually was concerned about me, that actually cared.
Mhm.
Then he began to kind of change his interaction, because I think that's how he saw the world before, is that everybody's against me, nobody likes me. And even people that might have tried to interact with him in certain ways, he was kind of distrustful, like, yeah, are they for real, or what's going on? Because
Sure.
that's how he was in the beginning with me. He was rather standoffish until we started to kind of break through that, and then it took some time for him to kind of build a level of trust.
Of course. Which makes sense, right? There's attachment wounds, and if somebody's in foster care, they have been taken away from their family for some reason. And it's, hard to trust people, particularly if they've been moved around from home to home and rejected in some capacity. Um, yeah, it takes a long time to build up that level of trust and safety within the relationship
Right.
to explore those deep topics, about how one feels about themselves without the mask, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something that had been brought up to me a number of times by different individuals of sometimes through their lives that's how they felt, that they did have to wear these masks, that they never really could be their authentic selves in a lot of situations.
Sure. Yeah, I think that is true for a great many humans, right? Like we're wearing masks in different situations with different people. The person that we show up with, that we show up as at work, might be different than the person that we show up as with a family member, or with a friend group, or at school. um, every place is a little bit different, but I think that there can be like healthy healthy versions of that mask, but then there can also be that unhealthy version of the mask because of the perception or the belief that I have to wear this mask in order for others to love and accept me, and because others don't love and accept me, I don't love and accept myself.
Right.
Which of course the goal is to try and help people to come to that place of loving and accepting themselves, um, without needing that condition to exist. That um, other people don't get to determine one's worth. We get to determine that for ourselves. Um, but that's a challenging. It's challenging to get there. Um, yeah. I'm curious, what do you think is there seems to be a relationship between spirituality and different like historic figures from faith that show up in these extreme states of mind with people. Do you know what might be the significance around that, or why that seems to happen?
From my experience, what I have seen is that, well, I guess you kind of call it archetypes, that sometimes people might gravitate towards certain stories, certain figures, certain mythology, because somehow that connects with them and
Hmm.
their own experience in some way. Um, well, kind of going back like to the woman with the Mary Magdalene
Yeah,
story, that there was definitely that connection in to that story, but she kind of absorbed it where she actually became that person. Um, so I've seen that many times. And what's often fascinated me too is how in some experiences that I've encountered, where people will connect with things that are actually apart from their own tradition. So I remember one of the more unusual experiences was an individual who, he wasn't raised Hindu, and
mhm,
he really didn't know a whole lot about that, but he was having these repetitive dreams of a figure that basically resembled Vishnu.
mhm.
And we kind of and we delved into that, and he had limited knowledge of that Hindu deity,
Fascinating.
but but he had encountered it, had read something about it at one point, and um and that particular deity is looked at as the preserver of the world. And so that concept of him wanting to be preserved from various things that were going on in his life, he connected uh, with that. And there were some other aspects too as to why he connected to that particular imagery. But but it wasn't a bad thing at all. It was actually that whenever he seemed to be in a lot of distress is when this dream or this imagery would come to him, and it was something that was kind of like a comfort to him, that okay, when this being came to him, that it was kind of giving him a message, okay, that everything was going to work out okay. So I just kind of worked with that and looked at, okay, well, if that has some particular significance to him, then so be it.
Mhm.
Um, and I think sometimes we get deeply afraid of certain experiences, because I remember a colleague who had worked with this child that his grandfather had passed away, and he was maybe like 5 years old at the time, but he was reporting seeing his grandfather, and his grandfather telling him various things. And initially the family was kind of, oh, we got to take him to the psychiatrist, and this is unusual. But they kind of looked at it from the perspective of, okay, well, is the grandfather telling him to do anything harmful or bad? No, it was all positive things. So why does that necessarily have to be problematic?
Right.
And well, may sound straight, but on the other hand, who's to say he wasn't seeing his grandfather? How do we know? We don't know. But aside from that, it wasn't doing him any harm. So why make it into a pathology when it not necessarily is that?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think it's interesting. A lot of young children will report those types of experiences, um, but they are dismissed by the adults in their life, or the adults have concerns when it may just be part of the way the brain is working at that time
Right.
in our life and in that stage of development. Um, but yeah, very interesting. I just know from working in various institutions and in hospitals, where people do come because they're under extreme points of duress and they're having these breaks from reality, that a lot of times the content is very religious or spiritual in nature. And I was just curious because other people have asked, you ever notice what is it about this experience that, people connect with um, these spiritual historic
And
figures?
I think oftentimes it's about a sense of comfort, of just wanting to feel comforted, or like I mentioned in the story with the person with the God and Satan sort of thing
Yeah,
going on, that
yeah,
sometimes they feel powerless, or they want some level of control over the events that are going on in their life. So there can be a whole number of reasons, but I think that's important to delve into, to explore. Well, what is the significance?
yeah. No, definitely. Oh, for listeners that might not be as familiar with working with individuals that experience those kinds of extreme states of mind. Do you have any other words of wisdom that you'd care to share that might be helpful?
I think a couple things is that what I would term radical compassion. So
Mm.
I think trying to embrace this idea of compassion, not as some future thing to come, but right now. How can we be compassionate and understanding individuals right now? And to also look at things in a patient way, and to realize, so I look at this too, that I'm only one person, and I can't change all of the dynamics that a person is going through, nor do I need to necessarily. Um, but if I can create a common healing space, just a place of sanctuary, even for a brief moment, that I can take that person from the distress that they are experiencing, and even for a brief moment, that they can have a sense of peace, then something has been accomplished.
Like that. Mhm. Yeah. I mean, because it might only be a momentary piece of time in that moment, and then they might resume back, but at least that moment occurred, and in that moment, that gives an opportunity for another moment to happen and build
Right.
upon that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, I certainly have appreciated talking with you today. I feel like it's shifted my perspective on a few things, which I'm grateful for. And I just enjoyed speaking with you about these topics that I don't think are talked about enough.
Well,
Um,
I appreciate the dialogue.
Yeah. If people wanted to learn more about you, more about your work, possibly read some of your books, because you've written quite a bit, where can they find more information about you?
I have a website that's at selfgrowth.com, which has links to a lot of past articles, talks, to some of the books, etc. So that would be definitely the starting point.
Okay. And I can put that in the show notes so that people can click on the link when they listen and find out more information about your work and um, your publishings, and yeah, learn more from you. So thank you so much for being willing to share your expertise and talk with me today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode with Dr. Dan Edmunds. I highly recommend you check out his work and see some of the other articles and talks that he's done. Um, I really enjoyed speaking with him about his work, uh, and his vast his vast knowledge on the topics of spirituality and really what it means to be human. I think at the end of the day, that was the like my takeaway is that, we can get rid of we if we pare down all of these labels, at the end of the day, what does it mean to be human, and how do we help our fellow humans from that place of compassion? And yeah, so I hope you enjoyed listening, and I look forward to sharing a new episode with you next week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Creative Psychotherapist. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For show notes, downloads, and additional resources, head over to the website at www.creativeclinicianscorner.com.